I didn't ask why no one wanted the shift. I needed the money. That was enough. My supervisor explained it as a temporary arrangement. A few nights covering for someone who had walked off without notice. He didn't elaborate. I didn't push. Night shifts are always the hardest to fill. People have families, routines, children waiting at home, reasons to sleep when the rest of the world does. I didn't have any of that anymore. The building was a logistics office on the outer edge of the industrial district, surrounded by warehouses and fenced yards full of trucks that sat quiet after sundown. During the day, the place was noise and motion, phones ringing, forklifts outside, the steady rhythm of people who had somewhere to be. At night, it became something else entirely. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel restful. The kind that sits on your shoulders. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was alone the entire time. The security desk occupied the center of the lobby, facing the main entrance. Behind me was a wall of monitors, 8 cameras covering the hallways, loading docks, stairwells, and 2 office floors. The footage was grainy, with a slight delay that made everything feel just slightly disconnected from reality. But they worked. My job was straightforward. Stay at the desk, watch the cameras, walk the building once per hour. Nothing complicated. The first night was uneventful. The second night was the same. Silence, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the occasional truck grinding past on the road outside. I drank too much coffee and read on my phone and watched the monitors out of habit more than obligation. On my third night, I noticed the pattern. At exactly 2:13 a.m., one of the office lights on the second floor turned on. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flicker, no gradual warming, just on. A rectangle of cold light filling the frame of a camera that had shown nothing but darkness all night. I sat forward and watched the monitor, waiting for movement. A shape crossing the room, a shadow passing a window. Anything. Nothing happened. At 2:14 a.m., the light turned off. I pulled up the recording immediately and scrubbed through it twice. No motion before, no motion after. Just the light appearing and disappearing without explanation. I told myself it was a timer. Old buildings are full of quirks like that, circuits connected to schedules no one remembers programming. Electrical memory. The fourth night, it happened again. Same time, same office. I noted the room number and went upstairs to check before my scheduled walkthrough. The office was empty and dark by the time I arrived. I tested the light switch. It worked. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Empty desks, chairs pushed in, a thin layer of dust on every surface. The kind of room that hadn't been used in a long time. I told myself again, electrical fault. I'd write a maintenance note. On the fifth night, I decided to be there when it happened. At 2:12 a.m., I climbed the stairs and walked the dark corridor toward the office. My footsteps felt too loud in the silence. The emergency lighting cast long orange shadows across the carpet, and the air up there was stale in a way that made me want to breathe shallowly. I stopped 10 feet from the doorway and waited. At 2:13 a.m., the light turned on. Not a flicker, not a gradual warming. Instant, full brightness. I didn't move. The office was exactly as it appeared on the monitors. Empty desks, dust undisturbed, chairs neatly aligned. No sound except the quiet hum of the bulb. I made myself step closer. I stood in the doorway and looked at every corner of the room. Nothing was out of place. Nothing breathed or shifted or made itself known. At 2:14 a.m., the light went off. The darkness that replaced it felt heavier than the darkness before. I stood in the doorway for longer than I should have. long enough that I became aware of my own heartbeat. Then I went back downstairs and checked the camera recording. It showed me standing in the doorway, still, alone. After that, I stopped going upstairs. I told myself it was practical. If something happened on the other floors while I was up there, I'd miss it on the monitors. But the truth was simpler than that. I watched instead, and that was when I started noticing the differences. Each night, something in the office was slightly changed. A chair no longer flush with the desk, pulled back by a few inches, as if someone had risen from it recently. A desk drawer not fully closed. A monitor angled a few degrees off from how I remembered it. Small things. The kind of things you could explain away individually. Together, they accumulated into something I didn't have a word for. One night I tested it. At 2:10 a.m. I went upstairs and methodically reset the room. Every chair fully pushed in, every drawer closed, every surface as undisturbed as I could make it. I took a mental photograph of the space and went back downstairs before 2:13. When the light came on, I watched the monitor with my arms crossed, leaning so close my nose nearly touched the screen. The office looked normal at first. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the chair nearest the camera began to move. Not fast, not sudden. A slow, silent slide backward, 3 or 4 inches. Then it stopped. My chest felt tight in a way I couldn't breathe past. I pulled up the recording, scrubbed back to the moment it happened. The camera hadn't captured the movement. It only showed the chair already out of position, as if it had always been that way, like something didn't want to be seen moving. After that, I started sleeping poorly during the day. I'd lie in bed and watch the light change behind my curtains and think about the room, about what it was doing while I watched and what it was doing while I didn't. I told my brother I was just tired from the night schedule. He believed me because it was a reasonable thing to believe. A week later, I heard something, not from upstairs, from behind me. A soft click, the sound a door makes when it settles, or when a handle is released. I turned around. The lobby was empty. The front doors were locked, chains threaded through the handles. The visitor chairs along the far walls sat in a line, undisturbed. The elevator light showed it resting on the ground floor, doors closed. I checked every camera. Nothing, except, and I noticed this only because I was already looking, the second-floor office light was already on. I checked the time, 2:13 a.m. exactly. I hadn't seen it turn on. I'd been looking away. And then I noticed the camera angle. It was different, not enough to be obvious, but enough that the frame showed a slightly wider view of the room than it had the night before. The right edge of the monitor was visible now, where it hadn't been. Something had adjusted the camera by a few degrees, by hand. I opened the archived footage from 2 hours earlier and played it forward at double speed. The camera moved at 1:48 a.m. The movement was too fast to see clearly. There, one frame, different the next. I didn't go upstairs that night, or the night after. But I kept watching, and the changes kept coming. Small, consistent, deliberate, each one deniable on its own. Together, they added up to something that felt like a message I couldn't quite read. Then, one night, the light turned on at 2:13 a.m. and did not turn off. 2:14 a.m. passed. I sat completely still at the desk, watching the monitor. The light stayed on. The office sat empty and bright in the grainy feed. 2:15 a.m., 2:16 a.m., nothing moved. And then, at the very edge of the camera frame, barely in the shot, occupying maybe 1/10 of the screen, something appeared. Not a person, Not clearly anything. A shape, a density in the light that was darker than the rest of the room. It remained for 3 seconds. Then it stepped back out of frame. The light turned off at 2:17 a.m. The next morning I asked my supervisor about the previous guard, the one who had quit without notice. He paused before answering, set down the pen he was holding. He stopped doing the second floor checks, he said. That was all. He picked up his pen again. The conversation was over. I drove home in daylight and sat in my parked car for 20 minutes before going inside. That night, I made a decision. I would not look at the monitor at 2:13 a.m. I would not go upstairs. I would sit at the desk and stare at the floor and let whatever it was do whatever it did, and I would simply not observe it. The light turned on at 2:13 a.m. I kept my eyes down. At 2:14 a.m. it turned off. At 2:15 a.m. something clicked behind me. I did not turn around. I sat with my hands flat on the desk and breathed and waited. Eventually, the night ended the way nights do. The windows lightened. The trucks outside started moving. I finished my shift and quit 2 days later. I didn't explain. They didn't ask. Last week I drove through the industrial district at night. I wasn't planning the route. I was coming back from a friend's place, and it was just the most direct way home. I didn't think about the building until I was already passing it. But I looked. The second floor windows were dark. Then, as I watched, the office light turned on. I kept driving. I told myself I would not look back, and I didn't. I made it 2 blocks before my phone, resting in the cup holder between the seats, buzzed against the plastic. A notification. I didn't recognize the sender. The app was one I didn't have. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. I pulled over under a streetlight and picked up the phone. There was no text in the message, only a photograph. The second floor office, taken from inside the room. The camera angle faced the door, the doorway I had stood in weeks ago, breathing shallowly in the dark, while something waited for me to step closer. The desk chairs were all neatly pushed in. The surfaces were undisturbed. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one thing. In the reflection of the dark monitor nearest the door, barely visible, barely there, a shape standing in the doorway. The shape was the right height, the right proportions, and it was facing into the room, like it had just arrived, like it was finally ready to come back. I set my phone face down in the cup holder and drove home without touching it again. When I got inside, I put it on the kitchen counter and went to bed. In the morning, the notification was gone. The app was gone. The photograph was gone. I've thought about going back to ask who they hired for the shift. I haven't. Some questions are only worth asking if you can live with the answers. And I've started to think that whatever was in that room isn't waiting for me anymore. I've started to think it found a way to follow,